Today's video is sponsored by longtime friend of the channel, Skillshare. I've been using Skillshare for a few months now to help me with making thumbnails, video editing, and with graphics. But with so many different topics that you can research on Skillshare, right now I am getting help on something that I should have done quite a while ago. And that is shedding off my winter weight. And Skillshare also has great courses on dieting and healthy living. If you're a longtime member of my community, you might have seen me talk about my experience with keto. And I'm looking to get back into it again. Right now, I'm participating in Brady Salcido's course on ketogenic dieting. And I'm doing this to help me get motivated again, and also to learn more about how to do it properly. And the first 1,000 people to use the link or my code, Mr. Terry History, are going to get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. All right, let's start the video. Hey there, I'm Mr. Terry, a high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher Reacts video. All right, in my continuing kind of coverage of the history of Ukraine and Russia and giving you guys better context, there is an event that if you don't know about it or don't know enough about it, I'm hoping that I can help you with that today. And that is an event called the Holodomor. Now, the Holodomor is a famine that occurred in Ukraine during the Stalin years of the USSR. And this is something that has created and has lasting effects in the relationship between the countries. Even though we're now a generation or two removed, it is still very much in the minds of people of these regions, especially amongst Ukrainians. So what I wanted to do here is share some commentary and respond to a popular video that has come out recently about the Holodomor from a popular YouTube channel, Vox. And the title of this video is How Stalin Starved Ukraine. So this is implying that there was intention to this, which is something a lot of people talk about. And I'm going to give you my take as we go through this. And again, this is a really important contextual situation that you need to understand and people need to understand about the relations of these countries. All right, the original video link is down below. Make sure you're supporting them. And if you haven't subbed to my channel, love to have you around in our community. And with that, let's get started.
Пухлих у полі по житах, а скільки лежало по дорозі мертвих.
Голодомор я добре пережила і пам'ятатиму, скільки житиму.
This is Rostislav, reading the words of his grandmother Lydia, who lived in Ukraine.
Це страшно дивитися і згадувати.
Lydia was a witness and survivor of a horrific man-made famine that killed millions in Ukraine.
My father has recorded an oral history that his grandmother told him, and he just recorded it in ink pen.
А в нас сім'я, 10 осіб. Батько увечері каже, подохнемо з голоду, щось треба робити.
Okay, so I'm sure they're going to get into the context here. So this is going to be the 1930s. And on the eve of Stalin's 5-year plans, which were these incredibly ambitious efforts to try to improve industry and agriculture. And that's going to be the context here. The Ukraine was one of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR, right? A nation that is within that umbrella of kind of the Russian Federation at this time. So you get this umbrella of the USSR. So they're under, at this time, basically the rule of the USSR.
The famine hit several parts of the Soviet Union from 1932 to 1933, but in Ukraine, it became known as the Holodomor, a term meaning death by starvation. It was genocide,
brutal,
carried out by a dictator
who
wanted to keep Ukraine under his control. And
now that region they just showed on the map too is heavy on grain. Russia today, and then back in the USSR, was one of the world's biggest grain producers. And they have a massive population, but when you collectivize agriculture, which is what they're going to do, that means you're in control of the distribution of it. And, you know, moving grain from one place to another, which is something that they'd be able to do, can have horrible effects if you don't manage it well. It can also be used as a tool of suppression and basically punish or starve out or something, intimidate entire regions if we're able to collectivize agriculture that way. Or Ukrainians had to deal with that.
Do everything in his power to cover it up for decades.
Yeah, it was largely covered up. One of the biggest famines in history was covered up quite successfully in a lot of ways. Maybe not unlike the Great Leap Forward and the famine that came out of China.
In
later after this.
1917, after the fall of the Russian Empire, Ukraine briefly gained freedom. But by 1922, it was...
As did, by the way, many countries. This region was also controlled by the Russian Empire, and one of the kind of terms of the Treaty of Versailles and just kind of overall understanding was that, you know, these empires would lose territories that wanted to be independent. And one of the places, you know, part of the Russian Empire that did get that was the Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, get that. But then World War II, of course, changes everything later on because the Soviet Union, you know, invades a lot of the former Russian Empire territories and almost gaining almost all of the old Russian Empire back.
Forcefully integrated into the newly formed Soviet Union and became known as the Ukrainian Socialist
USSR
Soviet Republic.
Finished up the,
At the time, the country
Russian
was
Civil War,
largely
too.
rural. Most of the population were villagers and farmers.
Self-reliance
Agricultural
is a
place.
very important thing for every Ukrainian.
Heavy
And so
agriculture.
having that piece of land, cultivating that land was something that was very important to so many.
In fact, Ukraine was known for its farmland. With
Yes.
some of the world's most fertile soil,
Right.
the country was a
Pretty
huge
wet,
grain producer,
a lot of rivers.
especially in these regions.
Right.
Over time, it became known as the breadbasket of the Soviet Union.
I mean, the USSR depended on Ukrainian food. They depended on it because the agriculture there is way better than in a lot of other parts of actual Russia.
And Joseph Stalin wanted complete control of it. When Stalin rose to power in the mid-1920s, a distinctly Ukrainian culture and national identity were thriving. But by the late 1920s, he and other Soviet leaders feared it could bring on a Ukrainian revolution.
Now, these are things, by the way, that people like Lenin, kind of the first leader of the Soviet Union, were trying to warn the other party members was about Joseph Stalin. I mean, in those latter years, Lenin would write about how he was very fearful of Joseph Stalin as being someone very short, aggressive with people, and could be tough. You know, he shouldn't be in a leadership position. He was the muscle of the revolutionary era. He's the guy that you get to do the dirty work, right? But was somebody that they, you know, like Lenin believed should not be in a leadership position. He would tell him, you know, don't let this guy do this. Right. And I think stuff like this of what, you know, we'll see what their take is going to be on Stalin here, on how much they believe this was manufactured by him. But these are the type of things, if you believe that Lenin was saying that that's the reason why he should not be in charge, is he'll go to these lengths.
They decided to crack down on what they saw as an ideological threat to the Soviet regime. And they began a widespread, violent purge of Ukrainian intellectuals along with priests and religious structures.
You have to think about it as kind of decapitating the leadership of the country.
I mean, the Orthodox Church was such a huge part of that culture too for Ukrainians, where, you know, major philosophy for the Communist Party was to take religion out of the state functionality, right? Saying that it had a role in oppression during the empire years and trying to remove that, whereas like Ukrainians were still very devout to that. So seeing that go down to Ukrainians was also sad in their eyes to see the Soviet Union come in and crack down on like religious sites.
Off its head, basically.
Around the same time, Stalin introduced a 5-year
There you go.
plan that would eventually give him control of Ukrainian agriculture. The goal
They
was
talk about
to
collectivization.
industrialize all of the Soviet Union at a rapid pace, which meant building up industries like electricity, coal, and steel.
If you didn't know, that Stalin is not his real name. Stalin means man of steel, and it makes sense because he wanted pretty much a super fast, like superhuman industrial effort. He said that is where the Soviet Union, Russia historically has been behind world powers, is in industrialization, which is true. We saw it in World War I and wanted just like a almost overnight. I mean, 5 years in the big picture of industrialization is almost like overnight, but it's going to take an incredible amount of intervention from the government. And that's where you see Stalin as a leader who's going to create a command economy, meaning the government is going to oversee all of the economic decisions for the country, which for them meant government control over industry as well as agriculture.
To fund this project, Stalin turned to the collectivization of agriculture. which meant consolidating individual farms across all of the Soviet Union into large, state-run farms.
If you combine...
Now, before they get to it, in case, you know, if they say it, this was kind of a sad thing for a lot of peasants because Russia was still practicing feudalism up until the war when the Russian monarchy is gone. Feudalism meaning peasants, serfs being bound to land and working land they don't own for a landlord. And after the Russian Revolution, the peasants got control of land for the first time. That was supposed to be what this was about, right? It's like putting the means of production in the hands of the working class. And that availability to have that kind of land ownership, or at least access to land at the very least, was very short-lived, because all of a sudden now it's like trading the aristocratic landlords from the Russian Empire, and within like 5 years just gets transferred now the landlords are the Communist Party.
You know, 60, 70, 80 small farms into one big farm. It's easier to control it. It's easier to extract surplus grain or surplus sugar or whatever that farm produces.
In Ukraine,
it's not though. That's what they're going to end up finding out later on, is that the collectivization didn't help in a lot of ways. It still was stymied in a lot of ways.
Gave Stalin direct control over grain production, which meant he could extract all of the crop to sell to the West as a way to fund Soviet industrialization.
Following that, they're selling their own food.
Policy of industrialization by
that money to industrialize can't come from nowhere. It has to come from somewhere. So you're selling food that should go to your own people. China had the same problem with the Great Leap Forward under Mao, was they would be selling grain to other countries to finance their country at the expense of feeding their own people, which created a way worse famine in China than the Holodomor, which is happening here.
Taking away everything that grew on the land, Stalin aimed to really destroy that connection between the land and life itself. That was one of the key ideological things in industrialization, saying that it's not about the land, it's about the state, the Soviet state, that will then provide for your livelihood.
Many Ukrainian farmers who had worked independently for their entire lives resisted Stalin's plan. So Stalin found another way to attack them. He launched a propaganda campaign to smear farmers. He labeled anyone resistant to collectivization a kulak, a Russian term for a wealthy peasant, and depicted them as greedy exploiters, capitalists, and enemies of the state.
Yeah. Stalin and the early Soviet Union were absolute masters of propaganda. They were so good at controlling the message and information coming in and out, and being able to, villainize enemies like that. So again, it's still on the cusp of the revolution in a way. So it was very easy to label somebody, just drop the capitalist word, right? And all of a sudden, bam, they're bad and are not worthy of what they own, right? So again, try to replace it. It's like, who do you want to be working for? The state, your countrymen, or these fat cats?
And sometimes as literal parasites.
This was a way to drive a wedge within a community.
Kill off the kulaks. They're going to kill them off.
I think
the landowners.
The Soviet state and what the Communist Party is trying to do on the ideological side.
No matter how rich or poor, Stalin seized the belongings of the so-called kulaks. He then exiled, imprisoned, or executed hundreds of thousands of them. And for the farmers who remained, he engineered a famine to starve them.
Go.
In 1931,
landowners,
Stalin
they're gone now.
deliberately set quotas for grain production that were far beyond the capacity of farmers across the Soviet Union. When farmers failed to meet those quotas, Stalin's men swept their farms to confiscate all the grain they could find. Records show the Soviets took over 4 million tons of grain from Ukraine alone in 1932. That same year, a new law punished anyone who took even a handful of grain or was caught hiding grain or bread with 10 years in prison or the death penalty.
This is supposed to be against the whole idea of like the socialist revolution, which is supposed to put the means of production, right? This stuff is supposed to be in the hands of the workers, and the exact opposite is actually happening. stuff's being taken away. They are not seeing the fruits of their labors. Literally, their labors of creating this food is being taken away from them and given to somewhere else, right? Not even the people, and like they were saying, not even people within the USSR, going to other places. So you're starving. Farmers are starving. There's an irony to that, right?
Stalin's oppressive collection policy created a famine that started spreading in grain-producing regions across the Soviet Union. Some party members sent Stalin letters about the growing crisis, pleading for a change in policy.
And that's what makes it so diabolical, because if a government is really concerned about its population, its people, then at the end of the first famine year, it can reverse its policies. But instead, the government and the party actually double down.
Their commitment to collectivization made the famine deadly in many parts of the Soviet Union. But when it came to Ukraine, Stalin's need for the complete submission of its people compounded the effects of the famine.
Yeah.
In the fall
Everyone
and
has to be on
winter
board.
of 1932, Soviet police began seizing not just grain, but anything edible, even livestock. Farms in Ukraine, and sometimes entire villages, were blacklisted for missing grain quotas, torn apart for food, and prohibited from receiving any supplies.
Now remember, there was further context with this, not just as Ukraine as an agricultural developer, but also a place that Stalin, who again was very paranoid about a lot of things, felt Ukraine could be a place that politically they have a hard time controlling, that it has more of these a diverging culture from Russia proper, and saw them again as a threat. So, in some ways, you might be saying that you hear people say that Stalin's using this as a method of control and to force submission, right? Rather than just it being about money to fund industrialization.
And in January 1933, knowing Ukrainians were leaving in search of food, Stalin closed the borders of Ukraine and policed migration from Ukrainian villages to cities too. In the coming months, tens of thousands of Ukrainian villagers were caught trying to flee and were sent back to their homes to starve.
This was a targeted extermination of
peasantry. That's where you, like you say, like you're about to say, where evident target is, you're not allowing your people to leave. That makes you look like the bad guy, right? That whatever you're going to use to justify for this, it's hard to hold that up when people are trying to leave and you're forcing them to stay. Look at that. People literally starving out on the streets there.
People tried to
Mass
find
graves.
food in, wherever they could, in rivers and streams. They began to eat their animals, their pets. They began to catch birds and mice, whatever they could find on trees that would give them some sort of sustenance. People were so desperate that they ate flesh from animals that they found on the road, and some even resorted to cannibalism.
That's the bottom. They're eating your own.
But
dead
even
humans.
in this unimaginable suffering, Ukrainians fought for their lives and each other.
She was my great-grandmother. I have fond memories of her. My dad, when he took me to her village, I was really young. So Lydia's house is actually my first memories. The way Holodomor happened, it was mostly happening in the rural areas. Lydia was a student at the time.
And she actually told me about...
By the way, notice on all these maps, they show, they don't show Crimea as part of Ukraine, because that's, Crimea is like the most Russian part of what eventually will be Ukraine. Ukraine finally gets it, or eventually gets its independence later on. They will get control of Crimea, which again is more context of how back in 2014 Russia went back after Crimea, which again has a much more Russian ties than anywhere else in this region.
In the rural areas, Lydia was a student at the time.
And she actually told me about how they survived.
Ноччю під деревом викопали ямку, у ямку поставили діжечку або ящик, насипали зерна, засипали землею і висипали попіл.
At
Bearing
night, they
food.
would make flour out of that wheat and make some makeshift bread. And the reason why they would do it at night is that nobody could see the smoke coming out of their windows.
Lydia describes horrific village scenes, seeing a mother die of starvation and police taking away children. Once, when Lydia saw her neighbors who had bloated bodies and couldn't get up, she started to sneak them bread and milk. It's likely due to her efforts that 7 people out of that family of 9 survived. After its peak in May and June of 1933, the famine slowly started
Been out
subsiding.
like
Likely because of a weakened
7-8
labor
months
force,
now.
the Soviet regime finally took measures to decrease grain confiscations and arrests. By 1934, most regions collectivized. Almost all farmers were working for the state. Though we will never know the total number of deaths from the Holodomor,
Yeah.
a recent study estimated nearly 4 million Ukrainians killed. Places
Nearly 4 million. Don't let numbers just be a passing, like, figment of non-existence, right? It's not just a number. Those are people. That's a person, right? It's hard to do that. Like when numbers, when they get so high, like you start to dehumanize the people. When you start seeing about these again huge numbers, because one number just seems like one of many, which it is, but it should have the opposite effect of seeing that high of number.
like the North Caucasus, with a large Ukrainian population, suffered greatly too.
Yeah, that wasn't the only place
And
that had
further
starvation.
east, Kazakhstan lost at least a third of its population. So many
I did not know the stat was that high. 1/3 of the population of Kazakhstan killed off or dies off. 1/3.
people perished during the Holodomor, that population. So many people perished during the Holodomor that the Soviet Union had to send people over to Ukraine to rebuild the labor force.
More
The
Russians.
main goal was to resettle those areas in order to work the land. There were settlers brought in from various parts of the Soviet Union,
17,000,
but
a
mainly
lot.
from Russia.
This
Now,
resettlement
this has important context right now, because a context right now in the invasion of Ukraine has been about, in Russia's aspect, or at least how they've portrayed it, as protecting Russian citizens there. So you can see one of the ways and one of the reasons why there is such a big Russian population in the USSR, or back then from the USSR, but today in Ukraine, because when 4 million people die somewhere, that provides opportunities for people to migrate in. So yeah, you have all these Russians, is that 100 or 117,000 end up coming in. So now you have a more Russian population moving into Ukraine, which is probably going to make them feel, again, like Ukraine's going to be more Russian now.
program set off a
That's
wave
some
of
important
future
context.
campaigns over the years. Many Russians moved here in the east and south, which are to this day places with large Russian populations.
And places that have been invaded. Right?
In
Mariupol,
Russia,
Crimea already
Stalin
before
carried
this.
out a massive disinformation campaign to cover up the famine he'd created. Throughout the crisis, he outright denied that a famine ever took place. He banned the Soviet press from reporting on the famine and banned foreign
lot of
correspondents
censorship.
from even going to Ukraine.
Credible
But
censorship
he
back then.
strategically allowed language that would effectively downplay the Holodomor. Words like food shortages or food supply problems. For example, Walter Duranty, a Moscow correspondent for the New York Times, who won a Pulitzer for his reporting on Stalin's success with the 5-year plan, denied the famine in his reporting.
Yeah. When you look at the actual statistics of the 5-year plans for industry and agriculture, it is a success. Just from a metric, it is a success. But of course, the process by which all this happened was very difficult. I mean, it was the only thing the Soviet Union was doing. It was just those two things. There's not much else going on. But then you see the methods by which they came to create this great input but it required, again, the collectivization, deep censorship, forced famines or whatever. Censorship, you're going to get the great purge here when dissenters are going to be purged out of society. A good, well over 1 million people involved in that. So did the ends justify the means, right? That would be the question.
Calling it a food shortage. Durante was challenged by others, including journalist Gareth Jones, who snuck into Ukraine and wrote a series of articles on how famine ruled Russia. At the time, Russia was a term many journalists used to describe the Soviet Union as a whole, including Ukraine. Jones wrote, "Everywhere was the cry, 'There is no bread. We are dying.'" In response, Durante, who had more influence than Jones, put out another article, this time insisting that Russians were hungry, but not starving.
Yeah.
Several photographers who also tried to expose the humanitarian crisis were arrested for their photos. Some managed to get their images to leaders in the West, but the images didn't mobilize support for Ukraine. The West didn't want to get involved in Soviet politics.
The most cautionary tale is remembering that the world didn't come to Ukraine's rescue. It seemed like an internal issue. There was a lot of misinformation, disinformation.
Outside of controlling the media narrative, Stalin destroyed archives.
All media stay controlled under the Stalin era. It's all state controlled. Nothing gets out without going through those filters.
And made sure death certificates didn't use the word starvation as a cause of death. And then there was the case of the 1937 census, whose findings showed a drop in the population of Ukraine.
So Stalin decided that he couldn't allow this to be made public. The people who compiled the census, most of them were arrested and some were even executed, and the census never became public.
Over the course of
just for doing it, not even just like filtering out the data, but like killing and jailing people that conducted the studies. Like, that sounds crazy, right?
Several decades, the Soviet Union continued to suppress the Holodomor. But in Ukraine, the truth was quietly passed down through generations.
It's not
in
out
more
of
recent
memory.
years, the Holodomor has been recognized by more than a dozen countries as a genocide. In fact, Raphael Lemkin, the
Remember,
researcher
genocide
who coined
needs
the
to
term genocide,
genocide needs to imply there's intent. It's systematic, right? Making that not just like some accidental famine that happened, but it was controlled. It was manufactured, right? And again, going back to the very beginning, using it as a way, was Stalin using it as a way to control Ukraine as an area that he feared could be one in opposition that needed that type of control to it.
applied it to Ukraine on the basis of 4 reasons: the extermination of intellectuals, the destruction of churches and priests, the starvation of farmers, and the fragmentation of Ukrainian people through resettlement. But the government of Russia has yet to acknowledge any historical responsibility for the famine. They've maintained, falsely, that the famine hit Russia just as hard. And today, similar tactics of disinformation are being used to perpetrate another violent attack
Modern
against
context.
Ukrainians.
If one looks at the coverage
Why we talk
provided
about
by
it, right?
Russian state media, it seems like the Ukrainians keep shelling themselves. It seems like it's somehow the Ukrainians' fault that there is this war in their own land.
It's war against our people. I can't imagine. The second time we step in the same river.
The whole cities right now in Ukraine are being obliterated. It is really my fear that if Russia were to
is why we're
be
talking about it,
successful in this current invasion of Ukraine, they will make sure that this page of history is rewritten and is forgotten.
Okay. All right, let's wrap this up. Anyway, this is the reason I wanted to show you this. I wanted to make sure you are all aware of the Holodomor, because it is really important in context of understanding the disassociation that Ukrainians have from Russia, because of this has not been forgotten, right? So yeah, it's been covered up and things, but to Ukrainian people, whether, again, if you want to talk about it as a manufactured thing, and it was Stalin, again, trying to intimidate the area or whatever it is, regardless of that, Ukrainians have felt it that way. And that's how it's been passed down. So you can see where there again is disconnection between Ukrainians and Russians, and why Ukraine may view Russia or views or many Ukrainians view Russia as an enemy because there's historical context here. You know, maybe not unsimilar or dissimilar to how relations between China and Japan are still bad, based off of the the atrocities of World War II with Japan and China, which again was largely brushed over in history, and at least by the Japanese, but by the Chinese people still view it as a very real thing that was not that long ago, and not something that has been forgiven. A similar thing I think is happening with Ukraine here in response to the Holodomor. So again, more context for you. Again, it's really important that you understand current events through the lens of historical context. Otherwise, you'll never be able to have an informed opinion. So make sure you share that, right? And learn more about these things to make yourself, again, a more informed human being, which is something we should all be striving for. Anyway, thanks again for being here. If you stayed this long, hit the like button. And again, I've been covering a lot of this stuff and trying to share as much information I can with you. So if you're looking for more of this, you're already in the right place. All right, original video link again is down below. Thanks again to Skillshare for sponsoring today's video. And with that, we'll see you next time. Bye.